A few weeks ago, I made a chat application using Node.js and WebSockets following Brad Traversy's YouTube video. While I was at that, I had a thought of leveraging the power of WebSockets and React to make a multiplayer game. Here's how I made a two-player online game of Uno using React.js and Socket.io. I'm not going to explain the code line by line. You can find the link to the repo in the video description. What I'm going to do is walk you through the process of writing the game logic. Hopefully by the end of this video you'll have an idea of how the game was actually made. So to get started, I created a new React app using the good old create React app. Inside this app, I created a game component. Inside the game component, I wanted to manage all of the game state. What do I mean by game state though? Game state is the data relevant to each game of Uno which I needed to keep track of by creating them as a React component state using of course the useState hook. You can find more information about this in the official React docs. Inside this game component, I first needed to keep track of whether the game was over or not. So I initialized a boolean state game over with an initial value of true. While I was at this, I also decided to keep track of the winner if there was one declared to be. So I had a state variable called winner with a default value of an empty string. I would set this to either player 1 or player 2 depending on the outcome of our game. Then I needed to keep track of the player's cards. Since our game was just 2-player, I created two variables called player 1 deck and player 2 deck and gave them an initial value of an empty array. I also needed to keep track of which player's turn it was. So turn, again, an empty string as the default value. Then I had to keep track of the two piles of cards in a game of Uno, the pile onto which the played cards are stacked and the pile from which cards are drawn during the game. So I created a played cards pile array and a draw card pile array, both of which were empty by default. Last but not least, I wanted to keep track of the current number and the current color, against which I would match the card played by the user and validate the move. So I had two strings called current color and current number which were again empty by default. With that, I had initialized all the game state I needed. Now it was time to code the logic, the difficult part. First I created an array called cards, which look like this. So a pack of Uno cards consists of 108 cards, which include 25 cards each of red, green, blue and yellow, 4 wild cards and 4 draw 4 wild cards. The 25 color cards included 1 0 card, 2 number cards from 1 to 9, 2 skips, 2 draw 2s and 2 reverse cards. Each card in my game was depicted using a string value as you can see on the screen. Now at the start of each game, so inside a use effect which ran once on component mount, I wanted to randomly distribute 7 cards from this pack to each player and then take one other random card from the remaining pack and put it in the played cards pile, which would essentially be the starting card. And then I wanted to put all the remaining cards into the draw card pile. So using the setter method returned from our useState hook, I set all the state values accordingly. I also set the current number and current color equal to the color and number of the starting card. Also, I set the turn state to player 1 and of course the game over state to false. Nice. Then I created a function called onCardPlayedHandler which would be executed on every player move. It took in one argument, the card played by the user, obviously. This function was where most of the magic happened. First I checked whose turn it was using our turn state variable. The following steps were duplicated for both players and executed conditionally depending on whose turn it was. I performed a switch statement on the played card. Case 1. If it was a symbol number card, I extracted its color and number and matched them with the current color and current number. If any of these were matched, I changed the game state like this. I removed the played card from the player's deck and added it to the played cards pile. I updated the current number and current color to the number and color of the played card, and I toggled the turn state to the other player. If neither the color nor the number were matched, I simply displayed an alert saying invalid move. Case 2. If it was a skip card, I extracted its color and matched it with the current color. If it was a match, I basically did the same thing, but this time I did not change the value of the turn state. If not, I triggered the same invalid move alert. Easy. Case 3. If it was a draw 2 card, I extracted its color and matched it with the current color. If it was a match, I pulled out the last two cards from the draw cards pile and added them to the other player's deck. Then I again removed the played card from the player's deck and added it to the played cards pile. I then updated the current color and current number state. I made sure not to update the turn state this time as well because playing a draw 2 card in Uno gives you an extra turn. Case 4. If it was a wild card, I triggered a prompt asking the player for the new color. I then removed the played wild card from the player's deck and added it to the played cards pile. I then updated the current color to this new color I received from the player. Then I updated the turn state. Case 5. If it was a draw for wild card, I triggered a prompt asking the player for the new color. Then I pulled out the last 4 cards from the draw cards pile and added them to the other player's deck. I then removed the played draw for wild card from the player's deck and added it to the played cards pile. I again made sure not to update the turn state this time as well because playing a draw for wild card in Uno also gives you an extra turn. With this, our on-card played handler function was ready. A few extra steps. Before updating the state after every move, I checked if the card played by the player was their last card. If it was, I set the game over state to true and the winner state to that particular player. I also created an Uno button and added a check to see if the player was playing the second to last card and had not pressed the Uno button, on which a penalty of drawing 2 cards was given. I also made sure to update the state using immutable update patterns since most of them were arrays and an array is a reference data type. Next, I created a function called onDrawCardHandler, which would be executed when the player did not have any playable cards and pressed the draw card button. In here, I extracted a random card from the draw cards pile and checked if it was playable. This was done by matching the number and color. If it was a wild card or a draw for wild card, it was automatically declared as playable. If the card was declared playable, I automatically executed the onCard played handler and sent this card as the function argument. If not, I added it to the player's deck and simply toggled the turn. With this, our client-side game logic was ready. The next step was to write some server-side code so that this game data could be exchanged in real time over a WebSocket server. For the server-side code, I npm installed Express and Socket.io. I set up a basic Express HTTP server and set up the Socket.io server connection. I also had to set up Socket.io on the client side so that they both could communicate with each other. I then created a users.js file and implemented the user room concept as instructed by the Socket.io docs. This allowed me to create remote rooms which took in users from the client side. This was done by sending a room code from the client side and using it to create a room on the server side. So every time a user loaded the component, they had to send a code to the server. I used a random code generator and query params for this. Now I had to exchange the game state in real time. For this, on the client side, instead of mutating the game state on each player move, I emitted that state to the Socket.io server and then from the server I sent it to all the players in that particular room. So basically the player would send the new game state as well as the other player in that very room. Then on the client side, upon receiving this new state, it was here where I updated the game state. This caused a state update on both instances of the game component, one on player 1's end, the other on player 2's. With this, our entire game was programmed and was working as it should. Now it was time to make things really come alive. I quickly sketched up a simple game page design. Then I downloaded this amazing Uno card game asset pack by Alex Durr from itch.io, the link to which is in the description as well. Then inside the game component's JSX code, I conditionally and dynamically rendered the images of the cards depending on the player's card deck state array. Clicking on these cards would trigger the onCardDrawnHandler function and the clicked card would be sent in as the function argument. I added the draw card and Uno buttons as well. I also checked if the game was over using the game over state and displayed a game over message accordingly. A little bit of CSS, a few different game sounds, some background music, and some Photoshop designs later, our game was ready.
I like shining, I like $1,000,000 deals. Where's my pen? Bitch, I'm signing. I like those Balenciagas, the ones that look like socks. I like going to the Tula. I put rocks all in my watch. I like texts from my exes when they want a second chance. I like proving niggas wrong. I do what they say I can't. They call me Cardi. Brody, banging body, spicy mommy, hot tamale, hotter than a Somali. Go, Ferrari, hop up the stoop, jump in the coupe. Big dip on top of the roof, flexing on bitches as hard as I can. Eating halal, driving a lamb. So that bitch, I'm sorry though. Got my coins like Mario. Yeah, they call me Cardi B. I run this shit like cardio. Diamond District in the chain. Certified, you know I'm gang. Drop the top and blow the brand. Oh, he's so handsome, what's his name? I need the dollars to change. Beat it up like piñata. Tell the jobs, close the curtains. That bitch make you nervous.
Chambean, pero no jalan. Tú compras todas las Jolambo, a mí me las regalan. I spend in the club, what you have in the bank. This is the new religion bank, el Latino gang. Yeah, está toda servieta, pero es que en el closet tengo mucha grasa. Ya mudé la Gucci pa' dentro de casa, yeah. Cabrón, a ti no te conocen ni en plaza. El diablo me llama, pero Jesucristo me abraza. Guerrero como Eddie, que viva la raza, yeah. Me gustan boricua, me gustan cubana. Me gusta el acento de la colombiana. Como me ve el culo la dominicana. Lo rico que me chinga la venezolana. Andamos activos, perico pim pim. Billetes de 100 en el maletín. Que retumbe el bajo y Valentín, yeah. Aquí prohibido amar, dile charitín. Que per pico le tengo claritín. Yo llego a la disco y se forma el motín.
Diamond District in the chain. Certified, you know I'm gang. Drop the top and blow the brand. Oh, he's so handsome, what's his name? I need the dollars to change. Beat it up like piñata. Tell the jobs, close the curtains. That bitch make you nervous.
Como Celia Cruz tengo el azúcar. Tú que va medio y se fue.
So that brings us to the end of this video. You can play this game by clicking on the link in the description. I really enjoyed making this game and I absolutely fell in love with React all the more. Since the making of this video, I also added text chat functionality to communicate with your opponent, and I am actively accepting more contributions to the game. Again, you can find the repo in the description. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to drop a like, comment, or even subscribe to the channel. Thank you for watching.